This video will focus on diminished passing chords. Diminished chords are fairly commonplace in jazz standards and have a certain classic sound about them. You can find diminished chords in many of the older classic songs, for example in Have You Met Miss Jones? Likewise in A Fine Romance. Diminished chords are constructed entirely of minor thirds. The chord symbol is written like this. When spelling the chord, we use a small circle to indicate the chord is diminished. For now, we'll also add a flat 7 to the chord spelling too. There's no need to add extensions to diminished chords, as they fall outside of major and minor harmony. There are two types of diminished scale, but only one will fit with the chord we're looking at, the C diminished 7 or a diminished flat 7. Diminished scales are described by how they are constructed. This is the tone-semitone diminished scale, often referred to as the whole half, as an American whole step, half step. As you can see, it's built by going up first a whole step or a tone, and then a half step or a semitone, and repeating the process. This scale does not work with the chord we're looking at, as it doesn't have a flattened seventh in the scale. So let's look at the other diminished scale. The semitone tone diminished scale, often referred to as half whole, is the second of the two diminished scales. And as you can see, it's built by going up first a half step or a semitone, and then a whole step or a tone, and repeating the process. This is the scale we'll refer to when we see the chord that's shown above, or any transposition of the same chord quality. Why? Because this chord has a flat 7. And the scale also has a flat 7. i.e. the note before the root is a tone away, and therefore it fits with the chord. This scale is also known in jazz as the dominant diminished scale. We'll find out how to use this scale in more depth another time. Possibly the most common use of the diminished chord is a 7 diminished 7. Let's have another look at our example from earlier, Have You Met Miss Jones? In the second bar, you'll find an example of a 7 diminished 7. You might be wondering why it's called a 7 diminished 7 when we're in the key of F major. Well, this is because we're naming it in relation to the next chord, or the chord it resolves to. F sharp is the 7th of G. The diminished chord here functions much like a secondary dominant. Let's look more closely at the F sharp diminished 7 to G minor 7 sequence to find out why. At the moment, the sequence works like this. F sharp diminished 7, 7 diminished 7 in G, resolves to G minor 7, or 2 minor 7 in F. The reason this works is because the 7 diminished 7 is very closely related to the 5 chord of G. Here's how. Let's add a note, a major third below the F sharp, a D. We now have a dominant cadence in the bass notes, D to G. The original diminished chord now functions at the heart of a new chord, a 5-7 flat 9. The F sharp becomes the third. The A becomes the 5th. The C becomes the 7th. And the E flat becomes the flat 9. The original 7 diminished 7 chord contains the same harmonic information, guide tones and extensions, as a dominant 5-7 flat 9. In this case, our F sharp diminished 7 contains all the same information as D7 flat 9. And we know that a D7 flat 9 resolves perfectly to G. In this case, it acts as a secondary dominant in the tune Have You Met Miss Jones? So let's have another look at Have You Met Miss Jones again. Now we know that 7 diminished 7 and 5/7 flat 9 chords are really similar. Let's try some chord substitutions. For the first one, we'll replace the F sharp diminished 7, a 7 diminished 7, with a 5/7 flat 9 in G, so D7 flat 9. By substituting the diminished chord and replacing it with a 5/7 flat 9, we've created a turnaround, with the new chord functioning as a secondary dominated chord 6. Remember our other example from earlier? A fine romance? Let's have a look at that. Have a look at bars 2 and 4. Each of these have a 7 diminished 7 chord. The C diminished 7 that resolves to D minor 6, and the D sharp diminished 7 which resolves to E minor 7. Using the same process as before, we can add a major third as a bass note to create a 5/7 flat 9 substitution. So starting with the 2 diminished chords, we add a major third below to create 2 new substitutions. Both chords are now 5/7 flat 9s, A7 flat 9 and B7 flat 9, and relate to their subsequent chords perfectly. Part of the charm of adding diminished chords is that they can create really smooth bass lines. For instance, here's the first 3 bars of a rhythm changes sequence. Let's substitute the dominant chords, the G9 and the F13, with 7 diminished 7 chords. The bass line now ascends chromatically. Another common diminished chord is the flat 3 diminished 7. It can be found on many jazz standards, including classics such as Night and Day and Body and Soul. Here's an example in My Romance. You can see the tonal center is B flat major. The flat 3 diminished 7 replaces chord 6 in the turnaround. I personally think of the flat 3 diminished 7 as a cousin to using a tritone sub on a 6th chord. Think of it this way: a standard turnaround at this point would probably have included a G9 here. A common sub would be a tritone sub, leaving us with D flat 9 sharp 11, which shares many of the voice leading qualities of the original chord. The flat 3 diminished 7, which in this case was D flat diminished 7. In the next video, we'll be looking at substitutions to reharmonize common sequences.